I would like to just introduce Kyle Normandin to introduce our guest this evening. Kyle joined us earlier this year to manage this Conserving Modern Architecture initiative. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to meet Kyle or I, we are having a drink at the end of tonight's lecture. So please come and say hello, and we'd love to get a chance to meet you all. That's part of the point of these events as well. So thank you all very much for coming along this evening. And Kyle.
Well, welcome everyone, and welcome to this evening's lecture on the restoration and reuse of the Nelle Factory by Wessel de Jonge. Just some information about our speaker, colleague, and friend. Wessel is a successful practicing architect and academic and co-founder of DOCOMOMO International. As some of you may know, DOCOMOMO International is a not-for-profit organization that is devoted to the documentation and conservation of buildings, sites, and neighborhoods from the modern movement. There are currently 59 chapters worldwide with over 2,300 members. Wessel's other work includes the restoration of the Zonnestraal Sanatorium in the Netherlands. And with that, I'd like to welcome Wessel to start this evening's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for coming. And thank you for the invitation to have me here at Getty tonight. I'm going to speak about a factory which is close to the house where I was born. It's close to the house where I live today, and it's actually also the base for my architectural practice, because we have our practice in the factories today. They used to produce coffee, tea, and tobacco there, and now it's a center for the creative industry, and I'm going to explain a little bit about that project tonight. So thanks again for the invitation. The factories of the Van Nelle Company are amongst the most remarkable examples of modern movement architecture in the Netherlands. As no other building, the ensemble represents the spirit of the machine age, to which the concept of economy was instrumental. At the same time, the factories represent the enlightened spirit of enterprise that resulted from the philosophy of the client, Kees van der Leeuw. By the late 1990s, these intellectual concepts provided an inspiration for a functional redevelopment of the buildings in the future, drawn up to suit a perspective for the buildings in the information age. Designed by Brinkman and van der Vlugt between 1925 and 1930, the Van Nelle factories are a condensation of new ideas from many different fields. The genesis of the first stage of the new plant, the tobacco factory, shows a radical application of a number of early 20th century cultural and technical conceptions. The factories thus have become known as a highly consistent realization of a new functional and objective architecture. They were shown at the 1927 Weissenhof exhibition in Stuttgart even before they were finished, and prominently displayed at Hitchcock and Johnson's famous 1932 exhibition on modern architecture at the MoMA in New York. The project was appreciated by avant-gardists as well as conservative traditionalists for the successful demonstration of the new architectural means of expression it held. Le Corbusier, in his 1936 obituary for Van der Vlugt, extensively praised this project, which appealed so much to the ideals he favored, but had never realized himself on such a scale yet. Before the construction of the new plant, the Van Nelle Company was accommodated in various downtown locations in Rotterdam in outdated buildings that prevented the implementation of modern management strategies. Kees van der Leeuw, the director, was a labor efficiency expert, well versed in the Taylorist and Fordist models, based on first-hand observation following his first trip to the United States in 1911. The vertical stacking of functions, the processing cycle of goods, including reception, quality control, processing, packing, and shipping, all based on the systematic use of elevators and conveyor belts, were inspired by the American assembly line models. What had a strong impact on van der Leeuw as well was his visit to the Nelle laboratory headquarters of the General Electric Company in Cleveland as part of a more extensive tour of 35 factory plants and institutions in November 1926. For a follower of theosophy, light was an essential aspect of architecture, not only because of its functional role and its contribution to one's state of well-being, but also because of its symbolic significance. It was his visit to Cleveland that roused his enthusiasm about the effects of indirect lighting. Moritz Kahn, The Design and Construction of Industrial Buildings, published in London in 1917, has been another main source of inspiration. There are obvious parallels between the arguments put forward by Kahn and those used by van der Leeuw in his explanatory remarks on the construction of the factory in 1930. Inspired by new marketing theories, Nelle became the first company in the Netherlands to develop a sales strategy for pre-packed products supported by the strong and remarkably modern graphics for their packagings and advertising. Here's another one. This is probably 1924. The site for the plant was chosen for its accessibility, but also for its strategic location for advertising purposes, close to a busy rail track that runs here. And this is the canal that connects to the Rotterdam harbor, which by then was the largest in Europe. And even if they started the construction, you see on the fence of the construction site, there was advertising in the direction of the railway line. So advertising was really a big thing. Since 1914, the architect Michiel Brinkman had developed various schemes for further planning, but those had to be postponed until he suddenly died early 1925 at the age of 52. In order to continue the development of the new factories, Director van der Leeuw invited the young architect Leendert van der Vlugt, that you see here, to associate with Michiel Brinkman's young son Jan in a few months after his father's death. And Jan was by then an undergraduate in civil engineering at Delft University. The program for the plant had meanwhile become more clear. The brief for the buildings was later summarized by the company director as follows: the appearance of the factory must be the consequence of the requirements for the interior. The design must respond to human demands as much as to mechanical ones, and additional cost for finishes can be considered responsible even without an evident advantage in terms of direct returns for the company. A scheme for 2 parallel factories with workshops in between was developed into a model based on enclosed courtyards in late 1926 until a master plan for an extendable single-slab factory was finally agreed by the end of that year. The idea was to create a modern and transparent working environment in the green, modeled after the American daylight factory. The layout of the plant is arranged around a factory street, that you see here. To the west, a long rectangular volume was projected, subdivided into 3 production sections for tobacco, coffee, and tea. At the south end of the factories, a curved office building was planned over here. Across a strip of warehouses, dispatch buildings, a boiler house, and a mechanics department were planned between the yard and the canal. Conveyor belts ran through glazed galleries over the factory street to connect the various buildings. Oh, oops. Sorry, wrong button. That you see here, the glazed bridge perpendicular to the factory and to meet the canal here. And this is the workshops, dispatch building, and so on. Additional storage facilities could later be built to the east, that's here, while the factories proper could be extended westward, which is that area. For the time being, a soccer field and other sports facilities were located behind the factories. This master plan was continuously adjusted to respond to new insights. For instance, the need for storage remained limited, so that only the middle dispatch building over here was actually constructed. And as a result, for the time being, the 2 galleries from the tobacco factory had to be projected diagonally to still reach the dispatch facilities. It's remarkable how such unplanned developments have eventually produced some of the most canonical images of the vanilla buildings. Another striking example is the cylindrical tea room on top of the tobacco factory that was added only during construction when the directors discovered the splendid view from the roof. Indeed, the factory scheme is ruled by the doctrine of spiritual economy, which involved the efficient employment of material properties and construction capacities, of scientific and technological developments, and of human resources, pairing functional criteria with social responsibilities. The social commitment of the company appears, for instance, from the working conditions inside, the washrooms and showers that were still missing in the workers' dwellings at that time, and sports facilities, a garden, a canteen, and a library to unwind after work. These social aspirations blended well with the commercial considerations of the client, taylorism and efficiency, as well as with his spiritual inspiration, theosophy, in which daylight has an important symbolic meaning. So the main volume, as I said, consists of 3 factories. The 8-story high tobacco factory, which is this volume, that was completed in 1928, followed by the coffee factory of 6 stories and a tea factory of 3 stories that were completed 1 year later in 1929. At both ends and between them, staircases are located. As these were linked to washrooms with showers, the stairs were alternatingly designated to the exclusive use by either men or women. Ruled by gravity, the products moved down floor by floor with each stage of processing. The decrease in height of the 3 factories is therefore explained from the number of production stages for each of these products. So apparently tobacco took more stages in production, so it required 7 floors, coffee a bit less, and 3 less again. The raw coffee was brought up to the top floor of the coffee factory, where skylights are found to provide access to northern light for the quality control of the raw coffee by color. That's after the conversion. The interior design is not by our office, by the way, it's done by the tenant. It's not really my taste, but it gives you the idea of the spectacular daylight qualities of this space. And then 2 floors down is the spectacular double high space with the coffee toasters that were controlled from a mezzanine. This is how we found it, the condition of the factory before we started our work. From the packing department on the ground floor, the goods were conveyed through the galleries to the dispatch building across to be shipped. Hence, the layout of the 3 factories reads as if production processes are directly transformed into material, as if the buildings are nothing more than industrious activity enveloped by a membrane of steel and glass. The linear layout of the factories can be explained by the daylighting principle, which required a very shallow building as well as flush ceilings. Preparatory studies concluded that a depth of about 19 meters, 57 feet, would ensure the incidence of sufficient daylight for the manufacturing process. And this is a difference with the American daylight factories, this elongating form, whereas the American factories were more like rectangles. The large glass fronts that were created as a consequence was also intended to serve the firm's corporate identity as a modern company. So you see this huge glass front, it's 220 meters, about a quarter of a kilometer long. Preference was given to a reinforced concrete structural frame because it made for faster and cheaper building and was fireproof. After some initial discussion on the merit of a concrete skeleton of columns with tie beams and secondary beams, structural engineer Jan Gerco Wiebinga came up with the solution of a beamless mushroom floor to allow daylight to enter freely and to save up 0.5 meter of construction height per floor as compared to a beam system, which meant that in the same volume they could fit in an entire floor in addition. This created many advantages in construction and foundations, as well as for the production process, in particular the savings in internal transportation. By placing the columns off the perimeter of the floor slabs, there is a reduction in static moments, which saves material again. The zone between the columns and the facade could be used for pipes and conveyors to clear the work floor. So all that stuff was put here and put there to leave the work floor clear. Also, the curtain wall could run smoothly and uninterrupted over the full height of the buildings. Inspiration for the glazings were drawn from the 1911 Fagus factory in Alfeld an der Leine in Germany and the 1914 Werkbund pavilion in Cologne, both designed by Walter Gropius and Alfred Meyer, as well as the workshop wing of Walter Gropius' 1926 Bauhaus in Dessau, which was a seminal curtain wall that you see here. At the Van Nelle, it's another picture of the Bauhaus. At the Van Nelle, the concept of the curtain wall construction is more sophisticated in terms of functionality and simplicity of assembly than the solutions of Gropius and Meyer. The steel curtain wall is, architecturally, technologically, and methodologically, the most advanced feature of the Van Nelle complex. Terms relating to the submission of tenders for the steel window frames included that a request for the difference in price supplied with double rather with single glazing, although this was eventually not carried through. It consists of self-supportive, story-high fronts of zinc-sprayed steel finished with aluminium paint. It was produced by the Braat Company in Delft, who used the building for advertising purposes as well. The proportioning of the facade fronts is entirely based on the glass panes that are used in Holland's greenhouses, where we grow our tomatoes and salads, which were therefore cheap and readily available. American sunshades, that you see here, and over there, were made of aluminium painted wooden slats to control solar heat gain. So many of the features that you find in the factories were actually imported from the USA, and brought to Rotterdam by the same ships that brought the tobacco from Kentucky, from the harbor of Baltimore. So we found the loading lists, and so specifying the amounts of tobacco that were brought to Rotterdam, and then by the end of the list it said like 120 toilet bowls, sunshades and things, so they were added to the packing list and brought to the harbor. Well, before the planning of the actual restoration works of the Van Nelle plant could start, extensive historic building surveys were carried out in order to research the building history of the various structures and to record the remaining historical features and finishes. To this end, the buildings were meticulously examined by a team of young architectural researchers. Their findings were matched with the original execution drawings, which were still kept in a building archive on the premises. Of particular interest was also the extensive photo archive that was available from the Van Nelle Company archives and that was still on site. The result of those surveys were summarized in so-called historic atlases of all floors and facades of all buildings. Zones of essential, great, or limited historic value were classified and distinguished by color, respectively in red, yellow, and green. These drawings were extremely helpful to the design process for the adaptive reuse of the buildings. Similarly, here's another one of the office block. And rather than producing historic building surveys with a lot of texts, the difference is that we used a lot of graphic material and visual material, which was very helpful in the design process because, you know, drawings are your means of communication when you design. So we prefer to make drawings of those historic facts rather than lengthy texts and all kind of theoretical blah blah. And it worked out pretty good. Well, similarly, the particularities of the historic materialization were recorded in documents modeled according to current building specifications, again, so that they could easily serve the design process straight away. Another advantage, and this is really important, another advantage of working with these historic atlases is that that this historic classification, you know, at some point it's inevitably subjective, but it can be discussed with the heritage officials and clarified before the actual design process is too far advanced, which means that it's faster and it requires less energy and investment before you can enter discussions with the heritage authorities. And in a design process where time is money, this was not an unimportant aspect. In addition, this is the same floor, but then in addition to the historic building surveys, also historic color research has been performed by Marielle Polman, investigating the remaining historic paints and other finishes. So here you see the same floor where she noted the colors of the flooring, for instance, which was rubber, partly an ultramarine, you'll see it probably later, and a light cream color. And let's go back for a while. This is the area, let me see, the area of the director's offices, which were here on a higher floor, but in this area, or no, sorry, in that area, where she found out all the original carpets and the patterns in the linoleum or in the rubber floor, sorry, that were used. You see a picture of the same room. You recognize probably the carpet and the little carpet over there. So if you go back again, you see the big carpet over here and the smaller one over there. So all that was recorded. And some of the interiors appeared surprisingly colorful, with yellow ochre cement floors, ultramarine rubber flooring, aquamarine and beige tilework, volatile turquoise, light green and mellow yellow walls, next to bright red and blue, white, grey, black, chrome and aluminium. Still, the use of color remains restrained and lucid, enhancing the overall impression of lightness. In the design of the buildings, the architects have adopted an abstract and transparent architecture, and the apparent simplicity of the details demonstrates the idea of dematerialization, producing a universal aesthetic. The point of departure for the original design was a universal organization of the factory space, the result being a factory building with both a highly flexible layout and an environment that guaranteed comfortable conditions for workers on the work floors. Also in the finished factories, one understands that the process was always leading, requiring a rational planning method that allowed for continuous change and allowed for the implementation of the latest insights in efficient production. The factory building was therefore designed to be flexible and extendable. Mechanical installations were built into the concrete skeleton with the use of a system of steel anchor bolts in the ceilings that you see here, and vertical channel irons at 4 sides of all columns that you see here. These architectonic features guaranteed that machinery could be updated as desired without resorting to axes and crowbars. After all, the electric hammer drill was not yet operational within the building industry until the middle 30s. I think in 32 it was invented by Black & Decker in the US, and it was produced by Bosch in Germany by 1935. So those type of equipment was not available when the factory was built. Electric cabling integrated into the floor topping relied on steel pipes for lighting, and for 3-phase current, conduits were made from inverted U-profile irons that ran along the columns over the full length of the floors, and each column had a hub for power and telephone. Internal transport continued with the use of rollways and conveyor belts that moved along exterior walls, and of chain conveyors which hung from the ceiling, that were imported from Austria and borrowed from the technology that they used for ski lifts and so on. So it was all invented for this place. This system eliminated the need for lorries inside the building, thus enabling the use of a relatively soft and warm floor finish, for which magnesite cement with wood chips was selected. Probably you know that as celluloid. I'm not sure in the USA. Celluloid was used at the Bauhaus as well. It's magnesite cement or magnesite concrete, they call it. It's very light, mixed with wood chips, and it's a relatively warm surface to avoid cold floors for the workers. So, as part of the preparation process, we analyzed how the production logistics actually worked. You know, this building was always mentioned in all the textbooks as the most functional building, and that the whole building was modeled after the production process and so on. But actually nobody ever figured out how the original production process worked. So when we were working on a monograph, a book on the building a few years back, we decided to do that. And actually we found this observation right, that indeed the factory was modeled according to the production process, and we decided to have a drawing made, you know, that more or less illustrates the whole effect or the whole routing of products and what happened where and everything, which was quite a nice job actually to do. Well, machine aesthetics, the movement of conveyors through the galleries and the transparent facades of the boiler house and control rooms showing switchboards and steaming machines created a stunning image of the dynamics of the machine age. Here you see the routing of people. I think the light blue is men, so if their staircase is there, the pink is the female workers, then the green is the directors who could move through the work floors over there, and the blue is the main director who had his separate entrance through the garage. There was a private stairs to his office, and then he had his reception room there in the tea room on top. So this all was mechanically thought of, and here you see the distribution of energy, the coal coming from the canal into the boiler house, and this whole distribution network is still there. So it was, well, really a machine, a building like a machine. And in the mid-1990s, the question emerged when the company decided to withdraw, to vacate this premises, how to find a new use for this magnificent structure. And of course, the machine age is now behind us. We're in the information age, or you could say we had to figure out how to move from the machine age to the screen age. So the adaptive reuse of historic industrial buildings like Nelle pose some particular challenges, which are mostly their remote location, their large scale, that mostly leads to multiple ownership when it comes to adaptive reuse. We are faced mostly with a poor compatibility with contemporary workspaces and also their poor physical performance in terms of their envelope, in terms of sustainability and so on. And for Nelle, these setbacks applied with no exception. When by January 1995, Sarah Lee, the then owners of the Nelle, announced a drastic reorganization in which all the manufacturing components would be relocated within 3 years, this came like a bolt from the blue. I can say that the heritage authorities in Rotterdam panicked immediately. It's a huge building, and the location is very problematic in terms of accessibility. But the owner, however, and I think that's remarkable, regarded it as his duty to its corporate image to transfer the cultural heritage of this monument in a responsible way. Therefore, a consultation body was established with representatives of the National Department for Conservation, also the Municipal Office for Architectural Conservation, the Rotterdam Development Corporation, the Department for Urban Planning and Public Housing of the city, and representatives of the city board. And they had several workshops to develop, directions for a concept of reuse, which had to fit in with the municipality's economic policies and provide new impetus to urban development and employment prospects for the city. New plans would not simply have to be impressive and financially viable, they would have to guarantee the conservation of the architecture. But the municipality had no desire whatsoever to buy the premises and did not come up with any initiative for a new use itself. And for American standards, this may sound a normal situation, but in Europe and in the Netherlands, involvement by the public authorities in historic conservation or preservation of buildings is far from unusual. But this time they said, no, we won't move in, it's too big, it's too risky, we don't know what to do with it, so we're not moving in. In order to avoid the risk that Nelle would be reduced to nothing but a multifunctional collection of buildings, the consultation body suggested to aim for a grand project, a complex attracting international audiences along the lines of the Pompidou Center in Paris, including theaters, museums, and a space for events. But as no one wished to be the groundbreaker, eventually a more pragmatic orientation on the property market was started, and I think that was much wiser actually. In the meantime, but totally unrelated, the Rotterdam Development Company had commissioned the consultancy Property Conversion in 1996 to find out to what extent a graphic business center could be developed in Rotterdam in order to enhance the local economy. This question was now extended by asking whether the graphic center could possibly become part of the conversion of Van Nelle. Because of the scale and fame of the complex, the target groups were broadened out to include architecture, information and communications technology, and education. The goal was to create a center for activity for about 100 small and medium-sized companies in the creative industry, plus supporting services. In November 1998, so that's 3 years after the company announced that they would vacate the premises, the 60,000 square meter buildings, that's about 600,000 square feet, that is, were acquired by a consortium of private developers that were backed up by 3 partners. In 2000, again 2 years later, in order to generate the investments for the conversion, it was again sold to a group of investors provided with a specially designed fiscal construct involving 340 private participants who benefited from tax deductions allowed for the maintenance of historic heritage on the condition that it would be in private hands. So by bringing in those private investors, the whole project became feasible. I think that was very creative and smart of the financial people in our team. The execution of the first phase of the redevelopment, the former tobacco, coffee and tea factories, was started in the summer of 2000, so in the same year. As soon as possible, a pioneer program of cultural events was scheduled to take place in order to put the initiative for the Van Nelle Design Factory on the map and raise public interest in the place. In the first phase, the three factories proper has been completed in 2004. The interest prospective tenants showed in the Van Nelle Design Factory was encouraging, but it was important as well to warn prospective tenants about the restrictions of additional rules and regulations for architectural heritage before pointing out the positive sides of the complex. So we invested quite a bit of time in, let's say, educating prospect tenants about, you know, the pros and cons of the buildings and the space that they were about to rent. And today also the dispatch building, the office block, the warehouses and the technical workshops have been redeveloped. And most of the 10 buildings are almost completely rented out as offices, studios and production space. Approximately 95 small and medium-sized businesses today employ 950 staff. Planning this process of restoration and transformation required the input of a huge number of professional parties and dedicated individuals, ranging from the clients and their management team, the researchers, the consultants participating in the various design teams for the respective building volumes and the landscaping, but also the civil servants that had to deal with all the permits and exemptions that we applied for, the contractors for construction and systems, their skilled workmen and women, security staff, facility managers, and so on. So it's many hundreds of people who contributed to the success of this conversion. The consultation body had suggested that the heritage authorities would produce a document which would make clear which aspects in terms of future urban developments and architectural characteristics had to be respected and to what extent, by proactively identifying the opportunities and risks attached to the Van Nelle project. The risks to be taken by parties on the property market would reduce, hopefully advancing the quality of bids. Their 1998 Cultural Historic Reconnaissance report ended up as a strong foundation for the adaptive reuse project and was even incorporated in the 1998 sales contract. The next step, a master plan for the Van Nelle Design Factory, has been drawn up by our office. Given the new use as a design factory, the idea was right from the start to make it into a team effort by involving various architects and consultancy teams in the redevelopment process, each assigned to one of the respective design challenges. So we had Klaasens Erdman, who did the factories proper. Our office did the dispatch building, Joris Molenaar, the office building, and Bruno Doedens of Dias Landscape Architects did the landscaping, and there were various other consultants involved, as well as construction companies and so on. As the coordinating architects, we performed the supervision over all the works carried out by the various design and consultancy teams in order to secure the overall integrity of the entire project. The master plan provided the basis for this process. I'm going to show you a few sketches that led to the master plan and not go into the master plan itself, where you see how the parceling of the plot was continued in a new extension that we proposed in the back that is not yet built. But as I realized that my client would probably have a problem to get a good profit out of the adaptive reuse part that is here, the red buildings, I made a plea to the authorities to allow them to build some new stuff in the back of the same area, you know, to make some money. And by allowing them to do that in the future, you know, there was a lot less pressure on the redevelopment project of the historic buildings. So that worked out quite nicely. And well, I'm going into detail a bit later on. So in 3D, that looked like this, and there's the extension area I just explained, which is not yet built. So our starting point was not to make a fixed plan or a very stationary design, but rather to develop a kind of scenario that would allow future change and adapt change, like the original factory was designed to adapt change. That was also the basis for our master plan. So our starting point has been to regard the factories not merely as rentable space, but rather as a dynamic and continuously changing whole of activities with their own character, so as to invite a dialogue between the old and the new. A balance has been defined between historic meanings, future functions, and relatively sustainable solutions in terms of energy consumption, daylight, and so on. Regarding the complex of buildings, we have chosen to restore the transparency of the original layout by re-establishing the independent setting of the buildings in the landscape and by respecting the long sightlines. So we made all these type of diagrams. Again, this is a very simple sketch, you know, with a felt pen and some paper we used as a means of communication with all the authorities rather than drawing up very formal drawings and so on. To stress that everything was open, we could talk about things and we could have an open discussion about the various aspects. This drawing, for instance, indicating all the sight lines towards the factories, but also from the factories to the outside, and also the transparency of the buildings themselves, which locations were actually where you were able to look through, and so on. So all these little drawings were quite helpful. For instance, in defining that, seen from a distance, the transparency of the factories was most apparent in the upper floors, whereas if you would be close by, the transparency would be most obvious on the lower floors. So we decided to make the smaller units in the middle section, you know, the more units you make, the more partitions you use, the less transparent the buildings will be. So that was helpful in designating where the larger units should be and where the smaller ones should be. And here's another one about traffic. You know, we wanted the factory street to be low on traffic. We wanted the parking lot in the back to be used from this side. We talked about the accessibility of the plot. You know, public transportation was not there when we started. Now it is. Boat connections to Delft and Rotterdam were not there. Now we have a boat landing. It's not here, but it's here. But anyway, those kind of things were done, and these drawings were helpful to do that. So there were actually quite a lot of investments made to improve the accessibility of the area. Well, one more, let's say, conceptual question, rather than all the practicalities of accessibility and all that, was the idea of collectivity versus individuality. Because when it comes to the ensemble of historic buildings themselves, one of these issues is to deal with the fact that the original plant was completely based on the idea of collectivity. This, of course, was a characteristic of the 1920s and 30s society, when people were still prepared, at least in the Netherlands, where people were still prepared to fit in with collective ideas and behavior, and in a way were willing to adjust to their context. Well, 21st century people are much more individually oriented and expect their context to be adjustable to their wishes and ideas. This is even more so with designers and others in the creative industry. In a highly individualized society like the Netherlands, people are now reluctant to accommodate oneself to collective ambitions. And this implied that we had to look for features that would support the qualities of the collective image of the factories without intervening too much in the individual freedom of tenants and users. A vital principle to achieve this was the idea to leave the general circulation system, consisting of hallways, staircases, corridors, and 2 of the glazed galleries, accessible to almost all the tenants. An important starting point for the factory buildings has been to accommodate the service area for tenants with coffee outlet and a restaurant, not on the ground floor of the former factories, but in the former toasting department on the 2nd floor of the coffee factory. I think it is over here. So this sector is now where the lunch restaurant and the coffee outlet is located. Some of the glazed galleries connect this level with other buildings, so it made it like a center of gravity of the whole complex of buildings. But also the tea room on the roof and larger parts of the ground floor areas are for common use. And this circulation system, together with these common spaces, creates an architectural route through the complex of buildings that allows one to experience the original design intentions to a great extent. So a few words about the design process for this adaptive reuse project. The conversion of historic buildings requires a different design approach as compared to new building design. However, the form, the physical existence of the building, came about. It is there, and we have to fit in a new program. When it comes to modern movement buildings, Louis Sullivan's adagium, form follows function, is easily reversed into function follows form. The design process for Van Nelle involved a top-down approach, going from the spatial ambitions on a large scale as defined in the master plan to the individual buildings and beyond, providing a sort of envelope for the conversion as a whole. But just as well, it involved a bottom-up approach, analyzing the spatial and functional qualities of elements, spaces, and indoor areas, and matching them with the new uses according to their compatibility with certain parts of the program. This way, the envelopes that were defined started to fill up like children fitting wooden blocks into a box. The results need to be reviewed time and again, meeting the common goals and on until the envelope is filled up. And the remaining gaps constitute the design challenges that needs our attention. One of the challenges of the conversion was this steel and glass envelope, because it's primarily due to their immense scale that the buildings appear as stout and robust as they are. But in fact, the glass-enclosed volumes are fragile, like soap bubbles, that burst as soon as the balance between content and surface tension would be disturbed. The skin of the building is characterized by the absence of material rather than the presence of it. And if there is little substance at all, it is almost impossible to change or add anything without disturbing the essence of the existing materialization. And this has posed enormous challenges to the redevelopment process for alternative use. In order to understand the strategic decisions that were made regarding the curtain walls of Van Nelle, we may cast an eye on some other projects of a similar background. I have to apologize for the quality of the left picture. I couldn't find anything better than this. This is the Boots factory designed for Nottingham by Sir Owen Williams in 1932. And here the choice was made to meet increased climate control demands by altering the facade itself, mainly by introducing sun-reflective double glazing. So the original building, you see the mushroom columns on all the floors, enormous structure over there as well. And also, in a part of the building that was still original, you see the transparency of the corners. And then after the conversion, it looks like this. And although the lightest and most neutral possible color tone for the glazing was chosen by our colleagues in Nottingham, the effect on the transparency of this building is seriously compromising the original architectural quality. We have shown with our project for the former Zonnestraal Sanatorium that was mentioned by Kyle in his introduction that this can be technically resolved and done in another way, but at a rather extreme cost. So for Zonnestraal, we were able to put in double glazing and so on, but it was a tremendously expensive exercise. And for a Vanelle project, this option was therefore prohibitive. Renzo Piano, in his design for the conversion of the Fiat Lingotto plant in Turin, also chose to resolve the thermal upgrading issue within the envelope itself. Given the year that these plans were made, when such sophisticated glazing options were not yet available, such as the ones that we used for Zonnestraal, this explains the strategy to replace the original steel-framed windows by double-glazed, thermally insulated aluminium frames. So this is the original windows, steel-framed windows, which were replaced by those, designed by Renzo Piano. Architecturally speaking, the facades at Lingotto, with its predominant frame of plastered concrete, can bear such an intervention much better than the Boots factory, for instance. And also because the new windows at Lingotto are simply very beautifully designed by the Piano studio. But the consequence of this strategy has been that also the parapets and columns had to be thermally insulated, completely covering the inside of the factory and increasing the size of the columns considerably. Given the fact that also the outside of the concrete work was completely replastered after consultation with the heritage authorities in order to protect the concrete, it's difficult to say how much of Trucco's original building we actually perceive, because everything is covered. At Vanelle, the choice was made to avoid such problems by adopting the principle of a secondary glazing on the inside that we put in this line and over there. Technically speaking, the demands made to the original facade were thereby reduced to the level of a simple rain screen. The outside of the buildings has been carefully kept intact by large-scale maintenance and repair of glass breakage with drawn sheet glass, as is still used in greenhouse construction in the Netherlands. One of the first stumbling blocks was that the idea for leasing the factories practically as a shell with only optional secondary glazings and partitions turned out to be difficult to achieve because of climate control problems. If a tenant decided to add a double-skin facade as a climate wall, while his neighbor chose single glazing, the differences in temperature between both spaces would lead to condensations, noise, and problems with drafts. So the original idea of my client to lease out little bits of the factory floor in that manner to save money in the initial stage, to reduce his initial investments, appeared not to be possible for practical reasons, as I just explained. And therefore, within this authentic envelope, an info has been realized in order to secure proper indoor conditions. It's like a box in a box, and just as well, a largely reversible intervention. At the shadow side, that's this side, a secondary glazing is located at distance from the original facade, leaving enough space for the corridors. So actually you walk in a cavity between the outer facade and the inner one. At the sunny side, which is this side, the glazing sits between the columns, corresponding with the position of the original sunshades, creating a climate wall. Solar heat gain is caught in between, as is the noise from the nearby railway. Natural air supply is allowed through the automated windows in the facade, over here, through the climate wall to enter the workspaces through acoustic inlets, which are here. So in the winter, the air is warmed up between the two facades, the two layers of glass, and the air that comes into the office space is actually preheated. Like in the past, all ducts and cables sit between the columns and the facade and are further distributed through the topping of the concrete floors. So all the cables run in this area and then are distributed in the topping on the floor in this direction. Here you see it in more detail. The installations over here and the double facade. And that, of course, required to sacrifice the topping of the floors. There were still some original floorings in the factory, but we found out it was about 10 to 20% was still original. The rest had been replaced in the past. So we negotiated with the heritage authorities that we could either put all the ventilation ducts and so on at the ceilings, which would have ruined the idea of the daylight factory with the flush ceilings and so on, or sacrifice the floor topping and put everything in there. And we agreed in the end that would be the best solution. So that had quite some consequences. Here's a picture of the climate wall with the acoustic inlets over here, the automated windows here. It's all computerized now. And this is the other side. So the infill for the factories has been designed so as to maintain the transparency of the buildings as much as possible. The new partitions parallel to the facades, made of custom-designed aluminium profiles, are fitted with various types of glass. Partitions between the rented units, you can see one over here, are still transparent above door height and never touch the original facade and never touch the ceilings as well. By leaving the ceilings and the mushroom heads of the columns untouched, the spatial qualities are still perceptible. It's a detail of one of those partitions. Before the introduction of these glass partitions was finally agreed, extensive tests were performed to minimize the effects of double reflections. And that was actually a test. Here's the secondary glazing put up as a mock-up to see to what extent we would have double reflections. And there are, as you can see, because here you don't see anything, here you do see them. But it also depended a lot on the weather condition, overcast skies or sun and so on. So in the end, we could agree that it was a good selection, a good choice. And here you see actually how the double facade works, seen from outside. The nocturnal image of the factory has played an important role in the modern image of the Nelle company as well, and it has been used extensively for advertising. According to van der Leeuw's preference, based on his experience when visiting the General Electric plant in Cleveland, the factories were fitted with indirect lighting. You see the original light fittings here. The original Siemens Halske fittings had all been lost, unfortunately. And we considered to remake them, but since today designers heavily depend on computers and their screens, the reinstallment of those types of lights was out of the question, because their opaque balloons would have created glare in monitor screens. And therefore we decided to take the original specifications as the starting point for a new design that you see here. And this has been modified, so this is a Zoom-Tobel product from Austria that has been modified so as to recreate the original lighting conditions without compromising their performance in terms of contemporary use. Like in the original situation, 2/3 of the light is reflected upwards against the ceilings and 1/3 is directed downlight. The original lighting level of 100 lux is doubled, but still only 30% of the standard lighting levels in modern offices in the Netherlands. Careful inquiries with our potential tenants proved that they preferred such lower light levels, as computer work is better performed under such conditions. The impact of the new lighting fixtures towards the outside has been carefully tested in advance. And the old, though not original, opaque balloons, however, were kept for the corridors and staircases. Furthermore, we restricted the types of lighting to the warm-colored light type 823 Kelvin, which is similar to incandescent light. Sorry, I'm going to skip that. The great power of the image of Nelle is a strong marketing tool for many users, and most of the new users, and contributing to their own company identity. So leaving this image intact is not only important for reasons of cultural history, but also in the interest of the tenants themselves. And it's precisely among the companies in the creative sector that we often find a paradox that while they wish to identify with the collective image of Nelle, they also wish to stand out individually. It is for this reason that in the final stages of the restoration, guidelines were drawn up for some aspects of the interior fittings and the positioning of high furniture, as well as company signage and so on. However, the attraction of this powerful machine excites enough enthusiasm with the tenants to compensate for these limitations. I'm going to skip a part of my lecture. This is the dispatch building. that we converted into a workspace as well by cutting out a large void in the middle to get daylight and so on into the building. I prefer rather to move on to a talk about color, which presented a particular problem in terms of conservation here. As far as the interior color scheme was concerned, it was fairly easy to take the initial situation as a starting point for the restoration. But when it comes to the exterior, the vanilla complex has a history as a whole, which is not so easy to take back to its original state. The initially unpainted plastered facades are not easily fitted into a single restoration concept because the buildings were completed at different times and the facades were made, finished, and maintained using different materials and only painted later on. So it was a patchwork of all kinds of finishes. And when the client expressed the wish to have all the facades painted, the question was whether the complex should be approached as a whole, in the same way as the interior rooms, or that each building should be given its own history, thus making the complex a sampler of colors, materials, and time layers. But it proved not possible to remove the later paints from the factories because this would have damaged the plaster irreversibly. But it was possible to approximately imitate the original non-homogeneous color of the plaster in a paint product. The advice of the National Heritage Department was, in anticipation of the follow-up investigation into all the external facades, to retain the color and the paint as has been found on each building at the moment of the initial survey. And that was more or less a color in this spectrum. And this grayish yellow color that was applied by the vanilla maintenance department until the 1990s was clearly not authentic, so there was no possible confusion about the facade having been given their original color. However, as a coordinating architect, I decided to respond to my client's demand to do away with this awful yellowish color. Therefore, I decided to have all the buildings finished with the same matte masonry paint, though each one in a different tint of warm, light grayish white, but significantly less yellow than the existing color. So this is the spectrum that we set up, and all the buildings are painted in one of these colors, producing slight differences and at the same time creating an integrated appearance. The full color investigation that was only performed later shows that the issues involved in the exterior are no different from the restoration of older buildings, in which the color study mainly clarifies the building history. And the design decisions is clear, they have to be taken by the restoration architect rather than by the researchers, because they don't come up with solutions, they only come up with an analysis. Well, anyway, all of this work was summarized in a main publication that we were able to do a few years later. And I know that it is in the library of the Getty, so if you're interested, it's in English as well, and in Dutch, of course. And the whole story about Van Nelle, the company, the buildings, and also the adaptive reuse and restoration project that we did is found in this book. Maybe some final observations before I end up with a few slides. You know, maybe some criticism in a way, reflecting on what we did since 1998 in the early part of the 21st century. And we had to make some changes in our views. First of all, during the development process, largely due to the economic decline in the ICT sector, which was one of the strongholds of our program, you know, we anticipated web designers and people from that industry to move in, and then we had the whole thing about the dot-com crisis, and the whole sector was reduced and so on, so they won't come. And so we shifted our program towards a broader concept encompassing leisure industry and entertainment industry. And the new tenants appeared also keen on the idea of leisure facilities in their immediate working environment. So we have quite a few companies who are active in the cinema industry and so on right now, which was not part of the original idea, but it works well. But it did require a more flexible zoning law, because, for instance, this cinema industry was not part of the zoning permissions we got. We are in an industrial area. We are not supposed to have any offices and so on there. So it's a kind of twilight zone in terms of the zoning plan that we are allowed to do this for the time being because it's a historic building and so on. But it really requires to have a zoning plan defined much more clearly to, in fact, legalize what we're actually doing with these buildings right now. And it's only since 2 years that we have started with the municipality to revise the zoning plans for the area, which I think is a bit late. And also in terms of risk management for my client, you know, that was 10 years after his initiative. I think that took far too much time to provide, let's say, a sort of security that the type of use that we proposed for these buildings and that we actually put in is also legal. That's a bit more relaxed to know that it is. And one of the other spin-offs of the project that we did was architectural tourism. You know, the factories had always been closed. They opened up maybe one day a year to have architectural tourists, let's say, to visit the premises. That was when the factory was still in use. And my client decided that it would be important in terms of placemaking, you know, to get more people to the premises, that people would know this place. And while we were performing a construction site, let's say, it was not without any risk, we attracted about 35,000 external visitors a year. And in the first year, it was even 70,000 visitors a year while we were doing the construction work. So it was a sort of, we had television programs broadcasted from the tea room, where the next morning there would be workers running around with steel beams and so on. So it was a rather interesting period, but also a bit confusing. And so it would require, to accommodate all these interested external parties, you know, to lower the threshold, and the premises would really need to be opened up. And we are working on a visitor center for the future still. But the critical phase for preserving the architectural integrity of any project this size is arguably the mid and long-term development. So not the initial development, but on the longer term. So after the initial stage of reconstruction and restoration has been concluded. What comes next strongly depends on effective facility management and procedures regarding the individualization of rented spaces, including lighting, signage, and so on, and effective incentives for maintenance and upkeep. And that's so far a bit of a weak point in our project. We forgot to design the maintenance and the management for when we would be done. And we left that to the new owners. And that's some sort of a mistake, because they have to catch up, they have to, you know, develop new strategies that we could have done for them. And though unfavorable, it may require long-term involvement of heritage authorities, architects, and/or the developers themselves to ensure the integrity of the concept. And in case of the Fiat Lingotto plant that I showed, I understand, for instance, that a decision was made to include Piano's master plan in the former designation documents for its status as a listed building. And the same thing, as it appears, will now happen with the Nelle preparing the World Heritage nomination for this factory that will be submitted to the World Heritage Center in Paris coming January. But one may wonder to what extent this is still congruent with the original ideas that sparked the creation of such buildings. Well, in conclusion, we may say that the planning team for the conversion of the Nelle saw its work rather as a process more than as a product. So, hence the title of my lecture, Nelle Reloaded. What we saw, you know, the buildings, some sort of the hardware, and we put in a new disk with software, and now the buildings are running again for another 50 years without making much change to the buildings themselves. So to conclude, the last few minutes, if I may, Mr. Chairman, to show some pictures of the project. I'm sorry, I'm a bit harsh voice, a bit sore. So this is how the original building looked again. And the nocturnal image, I think I showed it before. That was immensely important to, to show the modernity of the company with electric light and steam engines and so on. And this is how the buildings look today. And I would like to point out the importance of the warm light that we used, as I explained, 823 Kelvin, which has this very warm tone and makes the building really stand out as compared to more contemporary structures. The back of the building I showed before, and this is after the adaptive reuse and restoration project. If you look closely, you can see the double facade system behind the original facade. And of course, this secondary glazing allowed us to keep the original facades completely original. We didn't change anything, and it's all still there. And it's also a sustainable solution, making use of the climate wall system. One of the floors in the original, just after completion, how it's used, I think I showed the picture before. You see how many, probably you can see it, how many of the staff actually were girls. So there was a huge social commitment from the company to take care of these girls and to keep them separate from the men who were doing the hard work, carrying the bags of coffee and so on. So there was a huge social program, as I explained, to take care of these people and to educate them. And this is how we found the factory in the early 1990s. Fluorescent light fixtures, single glazing, windows that could not be shut properly anymore. So there was a lot of drafts. Here you can see how we put all the systems on top of the concrete floors. The floor topping has been removed here already, allowing us like 10 centimeters of space to fit in all this is the cable ducts with the hubs. This is the air exhaust of the unit that is below. This is the cold water and hot water systems, electricity. And all is distributed between the columns and the facade that you see here. And after that, the floors were closed again with a light concrete mix, floor topping. And then there was a seamless flooring of polyurethane to imitate, in a way, the jointless floors that were in the factory originally. Of course, for hygiene and so on, they needed seamless floors. And we did. This is an architect's office that's on a floor above ours. Here you see how the partitions are only 2 meters 25 high, and it's always glass. So you see actually the ceiling of your neighbor, which is not always convenient. If you want to switch your lights off and your neighbor decides to have his lights on, you still see them. But it gives the feeling of this huge space where we had to cut up all these factory halls into small pieces for economic reasons. And by using the glass, you still perceive the size and the scale actually of the factory floors. This is the toasting department during the works. And how it is now, it's our lunch restaurant. There's a coffee outlet. We pick up our mail there. So it's the meeting place of the factory. Everybody gets there once a day at least to have a coffee, to pick up the mail or have lunch. And the mailboxes we designed to mimic the original tea trolleys that were all over the place when we got there. So they're on wheels, driving the mailman mad, because one morning he comes in, they're over there, and the next morning they're over there. But it all adds up, to this atmosphere of industrious activity and dynamics and so on. And of course, we did some real restoration work. The sanitary facilities that were still original but damaged. So we did a lot of work there. This is the area on the mezzanine of the restaurant where we made meeting rooms, so all the tenants can rent relatively small offices, because you can rent a meeting room over there, have coffee and tea or lunch brought up from the restaurant. So it's all very, very compact and and actually a nice atmosphere. The lounge next to these meeting rooms, you get a lot of sun in the winter, so it's a nice area to sit down with your client or with a colleague to have a talk. This is the tea room. We only knew it from black and white photographs. And our color researchers did a lot of research on that wall. You can see it's gray in this picture. And actually she found out, yes, it's this one, that the original color was a kind of nocturnal blue. And there were little dashes of silver paint, mimicking, we think, a starry sky. And if you then look at this lamp fixture, which was original, still is original, and the clock, knowing that Mr. van der Leeuw was a theosophist, had this interest in a position of man in the cosmos, we think there was it was like a private place for him to sit down and reflect on things. And it's a marvelous space with a beautiful view. And we were able to restore the rubber flooring, which mimics the plan of the tea room, actually, this 3/4 of a circle. Here you see that's the skyline of Rotterdam. It's a little bit like Los Angeles, but Rotterdam is the most American town of the Netherlands. It's probably due to that the center was bombed out by the Nazis in 1940, I don't know. We had a lot of space. Well, and we didn't have to change anything here. All the chrome work was still original. We only had to polish it. And well, it's the restaurant, as I explained, but a few hours later it may look like this, the catwalk. Well, this is the ground floor, which was left. There's no single tenant for that area. We left it open for all kind of events, exhibitions, concerts, and so on. And it's so this is how it can be used, maybe one evening. We have all kind of events there. Most of them are design related. It may be the presentation of a new model of Mercedes-Benz. It may be a fair of interior design. It may be, well, all kind of meetings that have to do with architecture or industrial design and so on. And well, that's how the factory looks in the evening. The signage, the neon signage, is one of the first in Europe, and it's still original and working. And that's how the building looks today. Thank you for your kind attention.
Extraordinary. Thank you very much, Wessel. We have room in the program for a few more questions, probably about 10 minutes left. So we have people with microphones. We would just ask that you stand up, say your name. If you prefer to give your affiliation, that's fine too, and then ask the question.
Yeah, my name is Barry Gittleson. I'm an architect. And the buildings over the years of photographs look amazingly in good shape, considering the war and everything else. The last pictures showed damage or the restrooms and so on, but it looked great. How did you find it in truth?
Thank you. Thank you. It's a very good question, and I like to go back to the point where I explained that the Nelle Factory was really important to the corporate image of the company. They used it in advertising and so on. And I remember even as a child that as a child you collect stamps, and I remember that some stamps, Dutch stamps we had with the factory, the image of the factory on that stamp. What I'm trying to say is that the factory is so well known, and the image of the buildings is so well known that for the Nelle company it has always been tremendously important to maintain the buildings meticulously. And I think it was only a year before they sold the property to my clients. The painters were still working and doing the maintenance work. The buildings were continuously maintained until the very last day that the company owned the premises. And they took pride in that, but they also felt it was their social and cultural responsibility to do so. Which means that we were very lucky that the buildings were handed over to us in a perfect, almost perfect state. Thank you. Sorry.
Michael Webb, architectural writer. You've achieved such a miracle of balance, it seems to me, between the integrity of the building and the intervention, the partitions, the adaptation to a new use. And I wonder if you've had inquiries from other major modern factories, such as the ones that Olivetti abandoned in Ivrea, where it seems they don't have a viable use for those buildings. They've been rented out to software companies, but it's all temporary, it's all very improvised, and from what I heard, it's a very unsure thing whether there is a future for those extraordinary buildings. Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much for this question. When we started the Vanilla project, I think that the Boots Wets building that I showed and the Lingotto were about the only two references in terms of scale and type of buildings. The Boots, on the one hand, remains to be used by the Boots company. And being a pharmaceutical industry, the demands on the facade in terms of ultraviolet and so on were very high. So the firm continues to make use of those buildings. The Lingotto, on the other hand, changed its program completely, its adaptive reuse. So we had a lot of we took a lot of interest in studying how they did that. But there were not so many other factories of this type that were that underwent adaptive reuse or restoration. I think a few examples. Well, Ivrea, Olivetti, as you mentioned, that came only a little bit later. We are in close contact to the people who are developing Ivrea into an open-air museum, and we know they did some very, very good projects by now, converting various of the factories into well, for other types of programs. I think the main problem here is often the scale. Just last year I was in Linz in Austria, where they also have a tobacco factory designed by Behrens. Well, this little baby is 60,000 square meters, but the one in Linz is 85,000 square meters, and Linz is a town like this. Rotterdam is not a big city, and for the Rotterdam economy, it has already been quite a job, to fill up this building, and it's still not easy, I can tell you. My clients are sometimes a bit nervous. Now we have an economic crisis in the Netherlands, and you have to be very careful. But the problem is often the scale, and I'm pretty sure that the factory in Linz, for instance, they, one of I think the most stupid things happened there is that in the end the city decided to buy it, and that's exactly what the city of Rotterdam refused to do. And in the end, the market came up with a proposal that apparently works. Well, in Linz, the city decided to buy it, this huge complex of buildings, and they don't really know what to do with it. So I think that is not the right way to deal with it, although I must admit that when it was decided that the conversion of the Vanilla had to rely on the market, I was a bit nervous myself. I was not yet the architect at that point. And within DOCOMOMO, well, we got quite nervous. It's one of our main modern movement sites, and we were really scared that, to have the market involved, that it would be out of control. But apparently things worked well, and well, I'm extremely proud that I was invited to work on this bill. I can tell you, when I got in touch with these people, I was a junior designer in one of the larger architecture companies in Rotterdam, working on adaptive reuse, but not well known at all. And I decided to approach the new owner, and he gave me like 10 minutes. In the end, it was a few hours, because I had been sketching on the building the night before, so I figured out what his problems may be. And I started the discussion about these issues, and he said, well, yes, you're right, that's my problem, and that's a problem for me. And so it was very nice, and a few days. But my idea was, that if I would be lucky, they would maybe let me do one of the warehouses, and I would be very proud that I could do a little project at the Vanilla. And of course, Renzo Piano or Norman Foster would be invited to be, the main architect. So when they called me 10 days later that they wanted to hire me, I was very proud, because I liked the idea to do one of the warehouses. And they said, well, that's not exactly what we had in mind. But I think that's really a compliment to my client, because they really try to involve younger people, who were maybe not well known, but as we say, with their heart in the right place. And so we had really a very good team. I already explained that, you know, as an architect, you're often the front man. You know, people think that you do everything. This is, of course, not true. You're an architect yourself, you know. And I always say that if you want to make a picture of all the people who contributed to this project, you need a wide-angle lens. You know, it's 150 people. And just one example is this fiscal construct that the financial guy, one of the three partners in the partnership, you know, that's a fiscal construct we normally use for film productions and to buy large ocean liners. And he came with the idea to use the same fiscal construct for a historic building, bringing in this issue of tax cuts, you know, for private people if they spend their money on the maintenance of historic buildings. It was genius, because the shareholders, they have a 1.5% extra profit due to this tax cuts, or deduction, is that? Yeah. So they're happy, and they actually provided the money to do the conversion. My client had money to buy the buildings, but he had not the money to do all the conversions. So that is how we got the money to do the conversion of the factories. The factories could be rented out, there was a cash flow, and with that money we went to the 4th building, and then there was a cash flow to the 5th building and 6th. So the whole setup, also in financial terms, was then very clever and very creative. And it's interesting that this project in a way sparked all this creativity. And maybe to add one little thing, if I may, I myself, I'm always struck by the fact that you know, this is a place where all kind of designers come together. It's not only architects, but industrial designers, graphic people, web designers, you name it. And they all identify with this building. They all identify with an image that is 80 years old. You know, and if you then think about sustainability, you know, designing buildings that are not fashionable, that you don't want to change after 10 years because you don't like the looks anymore, you know, this is real timeless quality. And people feel okay with it. It looks good, they identify with it, they love it. And I think that's the basis for real sustainability in architecture.
Well, we're right on time. Wessel, thank you very much for your lecture, everyone. This concludes our program for this evening. We have a nice reception awaiting you all in the lobby here. So thank you very much.